This short video explores how and why we focus on racial disparities when thinking about justice and equity within our criminal justice system. If it troubles you when law enforcement seemingly targets one ethnic or racial group rather than another, and I think it should, and if you believe such targeting is unconstitutional, you have the dirty laundry, and I literally mean the dirty laundry, of people like this to thank. What do I mean by that? Here's the story. Lots of men, single men, moved to California in the 1880s, in the 1840s, hoping to get rich off gold mining. They were more than willing to do the difficult work of mining for gold, but what they weren't willing to do is their own laundry. They refused to wash their clothes because at the time that was women's work. And Chinese immigrants who had found their moving into lots of occupations blocked by anti-Chinese laws or just racism moved into the laundry industry. Chinese laundries became very popular in Chinatown, in San Francisco, and California more broadly, and any place where there was a Chinatown, including New York. This was a industry that basically served any community that had large numbers of single men. Problem was, Americans didn't much like Chinese, particularly in California. Here, for example, is a drawing from a popular magazine at the time comparing the Chinese biologically to chimpanzees and monkeys. Here's a political image from a popular magazine at the time, The Wasp, calling for the expulsion of all Chinese and focusing on their role in laundries. So in 1880, the city of San Francisco passed a law that criminalized running a laundry in a wooden building, and most buildings in San Francisco at the time were wooden, without a license from the city government. Nothing about this law specifies the Chinese. The law is, on its face, in its text, race neutral. But the application of the law was decidedly not race neutral. Every single one of the white applicants for a license for a laundry, and there were 80 of them, got their applications approved. All but one of the 200 Chinese applicants for licenses found their licenses rejected. And the Supreme Court, in Yik Wu v. Hopkins in 1886, found that a law that, even if it were race neutral on its face, but in its application targeted one group, that law was inherently unconstitutional. Sidebar here, quick commentary. The case is known as Yik Wu, but the person who challenged the being arrested for running a laundry was actually named Li Yik. The policeman who arrested him wasn't much particularly interested in Chinese names and wrote down the name of the laundry, Yik Wu, as opposed to the name of the launderer, Yi Lik. Yik Wu was actually a pun off Li Yik's name. All right, so this logic, this idea that when we see racial disparities, it must be proof of a racial or racist application of the law underwrites or animates much of our discussion about inequalities, racial inequalities in our criminal justice system. Here, for example, is a Twitter posting by Captive Voices, a decarceration group in New Jersey, and they point out that while only 14% of New Jersey's population is black, 61% of its prison population is black, suggesting, Captive Voices would say, that there's racism at work, unconstitutional application of the law at work. Here's a similar graphic by the ACLU of Massachusetts pointing out that while only 22% of Massachusetts' population is Black or Latino, nearly 6 out of 10 of everyone who's behind bars in Massachusetts is Black or Latino. And all of this is part of this discussion that when we see racial disparities in the criminal justice system, it's proof of racism, a racist application of the law. But the issue isn't as straightforward as these numbers presented by advocates might suggest. Let me run through an example. Let's say that 12% of the US population is Etruscan, but 22% of those arrested for assault are Etruscan. This disparity, 22 versus 12%, might suggest the police or the criminal justice system more broadly are targeting Etruscans. How else to explain for the gap between the share of all of those being arrested for assault, who are Etruscan, 22, and the share of the population that's Etruscan, 12. If this is 22 and this is 12, there must be an anti-Etruscan bias at work in this hypothetical example. But let's add another piece of data, not just the share of everyone who's arrested for assault, that's Etruscan, and the share of the total population, that's Etruscan, but let's add a third data point. The share of everyone who committed assault who's Etruscan. And when we look at police data, giving us the race or ethnicity of perpetrators, that data comes not from the police, but rather from the victims, who, hoping the police will catch the perpetrator, identify the race of the perpetrator. So let's say that 30% of the people accused of assault by victims are Etruscan, but only 22% of everyone arrested for assault is Etruscan. This data point would suggest that we're actually under-arresting Etruscans for assault. 1/3 of all assaults seem to be committed by Etruscans, and yet only 22% of those arrested for assault are Etruscan. So it doesn't matter, goes this argument, the share of the population that's Etruscan. That benchmark, the population, is irrelevant. What matters, goes the logic, is the share of all people arrested for a particular offense that belong to a particular ethnic group or racial group. If 1/3 of all people who commit assault are from group X, as long as the percentage of people that we incarcerate or arrest don't exceed that number, then we're not, in fact, targeting that group. We often call these benchmarks. That is, when assessing whether or not a particular practice is racist in the criminal justice system, should we compare the data from that practice to a group's share of the population, a population benchmark, or the share of offenders from that community, right? 30% of everyone who commits assault is Etruscan. So, one's a population benchmark, and one is an offending benchmark. A little sidebar here about hatred of the Chinese. It's easy to forget what a widespread phenomenon this was, and not just within the United States. This, for example, is a book from 1934, El Ejemplo de Sonora, which argued that Mexico, if it wanted to see social progress, would have to kick out Chinese Mexicans. And the book functions much like a Mexican Mein Kampf, except rather than making an argument for hatred of Jews, it makes an argument for hatred of the Chinese. And the book is filled with racist images of the Chinese. Here is what a typical Chinese man looks like. He's a vector of disease, and he's got these exaggerated racial features. Here's an image that suggests what's going to happen if a Mexican woman marries a Chinese man. She's going to be left impoverished. and without a supporter. And these weren't just ideas in Mexico, this anti-Chinese immigrant sentiment. They had real consequences in ways that Mexico is now only acknowledging. This is an article from The Guardian, an important British magazine, acknowledging that Mexico is finally facing up to a massacre from 1911 when Mexican troops and Mexican residents killed 303 Chinese residents of the town of Torreon. Here, again from the same magazine article, is a picture from the time of a wagon carting off the dead bodies. 303 is a large number of victims for a race riot. The famous Tulsa race riot in the United States probably saw slightly fewer number of victims. This was about half of the Chinese population of Torreon was killed in this race riot. Mexico is, in fact, just now beginning to acknowledge its history of racist violence and anti-immigrant violence against the Chinese. This is a newspaper article from the Mexico News Daily about a museum exhibit in Mexico City from 2013, discussing both the massacre in Torreon and the subsequent cover-up of that violent anti-immigrant history in Mexico. If you're interested in anti-Chinese racism in Mexico, which is part of a larger pattern of anti-Asian immigrant sentiment throughout Latin America, there's an excellent book on it called Chino, and I highly recommend it. It makes for excellent reading for understanding sort of the global anti-Asian immigrant sentiment at the time.